Hey everybody, this is our next lesson in Imperialism, and in this lesson we're going to focus on the Spanish-American War. All right, first things first, just for some background. Obviously, if it's the Spanish-American War, first let's look at it from the Spanish side. Spain had been very powerful. You may remember early 1800s with all of its, or 1700s really. There had been a lot of exploration from Spain. Remember, the Spanish were the ones who gave Christopher Columbus the money to do his voyages of exploration. You may remember the Spanish Empire included a lot of territory in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, that's why so much of Latin America speaks Spanish, right? It's because they were part of the Spanish Empire. Anyway, what happens is by this time, as we're getting into the late 1800s, the Spanish Empire had shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. It had lost most of its territory in South. Basically, it had lost its territory in South America. Remember, those were the wars of independence with. That was with Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, for those of you who took global before. But anyway, it had lost its empires in South America, it lost its colonies there in South America. But it was able to retain, as you can see in the map on the right, it was able to maintain land in the Philippines, had a couple of islands, so Puerto Rico, Cuba, those Caribbean islands still were part of the Spanish Empire. So what happens is rebels in Cuba and the Philippines are looking for self-determination. They want to get rid of Spanish, they no longer want to be part of the Spanish Empire. They are seeking independence. So they are trying to fight against Spanish control. Again, the Cuba and the Philippines. They are not successful. Now, when it comes to the Spanish Empire, the U.S. had a really important trading relationship with Cuba. Cuba is an island where they had many sugar plantations. And again, for those of you who took global, you may remember how important sugar was, what a very valuable crop it was. And for the United States, this was a very, very valuable trading relationship. So we already had a strong interest in this part of the world. What happens is one of the big drivers for the Spanish-American War is something known as yellow journalism. And you must know that term, yellow journalism. And what that refers to is the fact that U.S. newspapers really were the ones to get people to want war. They're the ones who got people all fired up, and they ran these really outrageous stories designed to get the American people to feel an emotional tie to these people, to get them angry, to get them upset about Spanish, and really light the fire to get people to want to go to war. As you can see, the U.S. newspapers made Spain look like complete evil monsters. So examples of headlines would be things like Spanish troops slaughter innocent Cuban civilians, and really taking these very biased headlines. You can see on the right, there's another example. Spanish ships on our coast. People died in the folds of Old Glory. That's referring to the fact that people died covered in the American flag, and really getting people in America and the U.S. so angry and juicing them up so much that the calls for war with Spain just get louder and louder. And there's a lot of public pressure on the U.S. government to declare war on Spain. I'm going to give you another example. Here's two other newspapers from the era. You can take a look at this one. This one is talking about how the destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, and that we are convinced the explosion of this warship was not an accident. So again, these newspapers making the American people believe that Spain had attacked the U.S. ship Maine, and that the Spanish had attacked us, this innocent ship, and therefore we had reason to go to war with them. You can even see here the newspaper is actually offering a reward for information about who, was the perpetrator of this Maine outrage. So saying whoever is responsible for blowing up the Maine, if anybody has information about it, that this newspaper is going to offer a $50,000 reward. Here's another headline. Crisis is at hand because the cabinet has a growing belief in Spanish treachery. So again, this is the Spanish being responsible for doing evil things against the United States. And again, talking about the Maine, as you can see, I underlined it in red, that the Maine was destroyed by an outside attack. And that, 253 people are known to be lost. And of course, it's the Spanish who had this sneaky attack on us. And these kinds of headlines get people just furious at Spain and feeling like we have to hit back. And the explosion of the U.S.S. Maine was really one of the biggest drivers of the war. So between the yellow journalism and the explosion of the Maine, those two things come together and the U.S. declares war on Spain. Now, it's important to remember the Spanish did not blow up the Maine. The Spanish were in no way responsible. Ends up that we have now evidence had come out and, people examine the ships. Ends up the engine exploded because the engine was busted. It was an internal explosion. It was a steam ship. Those things were, they're very easy, they build up too much pressure and kaboom. Had nothing to do with the Spanish. It was not an attack. They were in no way responsible. But the facts didn't matter. People believed that the Spanish were involved. And that's what we ended up, because the newspapers blamed Spain, people just assumed it to be true. And we ended up going to war. And again, you can see a Spanish diplomat also had insulted our president in a letter. That was another one that, again, nudged it. But really, the explosion of the U.S.S. Maine is really the big driver for this war. Again, the explosion of the Maine and yellow journalism. So that leads us to the Spanish-American War. Please do not confuse the Mexican-American War with the Spanish-American War. That's kind of obnoxious and rude. Spain and Mexico are two different countries, okay? I know they both speak Spanish, but that's where the comparison should end, okay? Remember, Mexico is located right on the border of the United States. So when we have the Mexican-American War, that's how we gain the Western territories, and the Southern territories, that's Southwest, where we get California, Texas, not Texas is the Texas War for Independence, a little confused, but New Mexico, Arizona, California, all that, as well as Texas, used to be part of Mexico. That's Mexican-American War. Spanish-American War is what you see on the map. That's how we get Cuba. That's how we get the Philippines. It's also how we're going to get Puerto Rico. So the Spanish-American War takes us outside the continental U.S. All right? Anyway, please don't confuse them. It's just embarrassing. Or if you do confuse them, don't tell anybody I'm your social studies teacher. You're going to embarrass me in front of my social studies friends. Anyway. So if we got the Spanish-American War, the fighting is going to take place in the Philippines and in Cuba. So as you can see from the map, the Philippines are located in Asia, and Cuba, again, is right off the coast of Florida. Now, you may remember we talked a little earlier when we still were having class in school about Teddy Roosevelt. And I told you how he was like a super macho man. One of the reasons he has this really, reputation of being like super macho is he led the Rough Riders, which is a volunteer army that fought in Cuba. And in fact, there's that photo there. I put the little red arrow above that's like the little red arrows right above Teddy Roosevelt, in fact, in that group picture. But yeah, he did some volunteer fighting in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and that helps raise his public profile. Anyway, so like I said, we are going to be fighting the Spanish-American War, and we are theoretically fighting these poor innocent countries against the brutality of Spain. That was the whole push, right? These were countries that wanted freedom from Spain, and we were going to help them. That was the idea of the Spanish-American War. Spoiler alert, doesn't work out exactly that way, all right? What ends up happening is after the Spanish-American War, the war ends with the Treaty of Paris. And I think there's been like 3 different treaties of Paris we've talked about, but here's one more. I swear, when in doubt, just say, where's the Treaty of Paris? I don't know. There's a bunch of them. But anyway, everybody likes to visit Paris, I guess, to sign a treaty. Yeah, any excuse. All right, so the Treaty of Paris says that Cuba will gain independence. So Cuba had fought for independence. Yay, Cuba gets independence from Spain. Puerto Rico and Guam, these are 2 U.S. territories. That means they are part of the United States. However, they are not states. They are not states of the United States, but they are possessions of the United States. So they're considered U.S. territories. Puerto Rico and Guam are now no longer part of the Spanish Empire. They are now part of the United States. In addition, the United States pays Spain $20 million for control over the Philippines. Okay. So again, theoretically, we were fighting to make all these countries independent. That's not what's going to happen. So I'll get into more detail in just a second. All right. So like I said, what are the effects of the Spanish-American War? This is really important. Again, you may remember one of the big drivers. Remember the military political reasons for imperialism? And it was, okay, first you want naval bases, but remember, what else do you want? When a country has a global empire, it also gets power and prestige. Remember that? One of the drivers for imperialism is to be recognized as powerful and have the prestige that comes with being a big shot on the world stage. Well, that's one of the things that comes out of the Spanish-American War, that people start viewing America as a big player, that we are actually one of the world powers because we are able to beat Spain. So again, we're going to take a bigger role in world affairs. And at this point, we are really going to be more focused on the Western Hemisphere. Activities in Asia and in Africa, that's going to be the focus of the European powers. For the United States, we're going to focus really on the Western Hemisphere. And again, we are going to gain new territory. So the United States is going to expand beyond its own borders. So beyond its continental borders, we had already added Hawaii and Alaska, and now we've added new territories, okay? And most citizens approve of imperialism. Again, it's part of that whole nationalism thing that we're the best country in the world and we're great and we're powerful and we deserve to have an empire. There's a little tinge of that also. That's social Darwinism. Remember that kind of racist belief that some countries are better than others. So there is a big push, and generally speaking, most American citizens do approve of imperialism. There are some notable exceptions, such as Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, who believe that, United States is supposed to be a land of freedom, and therefore creating these empires and conquering foreign lands is not what America should be about, but they are in the minority. Most people approve of imperialism. Okay, you may remember I had showed you this picture before, and maybe you had wondered, why are all of these kids pictured in the school? And now you understand why. Hawaii is, as you can see, Hawaii was in the blue. We had already conquered Hawaii. Remember, we talked about that in the last PowerPoint slide, that Hawaii was filled with Native Hawaiians, and they're considered non-whites, and they are not viewed as equal to white Europeans. We also have, as you can see, the Philippines and Puerto Rico. So now you understand how the Philippines and Puerto Rico are going to become part of the United States due to this Spanish-American War. In addition, our relationship with Cuba is going to change. Now, according to the terms of the treaty, Cuba is supposed to have gained independence. But what we're going to see is that does not happen. All right? What in fact happens, we're going to focus right now on what happens to Cuba due to the U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War. What ends up happening is Cuba is going to become a U.S. protectorate. And when you call something a protectorate, those of you who had global history before Global 10, you may remember calling a country a protectorate basically means it's your colony. It's very similar to that. So the United States is going to occupy Cuba for 4 years, and we insert the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution. So Cuba is going to develop its own constitution because theoretically Cuba is a quote-unquote independent country, right? But we have enough authority and power over Cuba that we force Cuba to include an amendment into their constitution which benefits the United States. So they were very kind of independent, as it were. Here's some political cartoons that kind of give you an idea of what the Platt Amendment means. As you can see, the Platt Amendment, the U.S. wants a sovereign Cuban nation. So again, when you call it a sovereign Cuban nation, it means that you want to give Cuba the authority to rule itself, that you view it as an independent nation, right? But in fact, although we say we want Cuba to be sovereign, that we want Cuba to be in charge of it itself, if you look at the cartoon, that's not how Cuba is drawn, right? Cuba is drawn as being on its knees, as being handcuffed to Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam is giving Cuba a to-do list. When you can tell a country what to do, when you force that country to be on its knees to you, when you're able to force the country to do what you want it to do, that's not treating Cuba as independent. That's treating Cuba like it's, well, I'm not going to use that word, but it's treating them as if they are like your child, like you can boss them around, and that's not very nice. Another cartoon on the right, again, similar idea. You have Uncle Sam with his finger up, right, talking to Cuba. Cuba is on its knees, pictured again like a child, so as if it's less than or inferior to Uncle Sam. And Cuba is like a child building its own independence, right? Like building this building as if you had like toy blocks, building your independence. And Uncle Sam, as you can see the line underneath it, what the words were underneath the cartoon, it said, encouraging the child, "That's right, my boy, go ahead. But remember, I'll always keep a father's eye on you." So in other words, Cuba is like a child, and like a child cannot be trusted. It is not, the Cuban people are not viewed as equal to America, that the U.S. is superior, and again, Cuba is inferior. And what belief is that? That's that social Darwinism, that belief that Cubans are inferior to America, and therefore, because they are inferior, they can't be trusted to rule themselves, that they need direction, they need to take orders from the United States, that the United States is superior to them. All right, so this Platt Amendment, this is where the United States is going to be giving Cuba orders. We force the Cubans to insert this into their own constitution. And what does this Platt Amendment do? It does a few things. First, it gives the United States special privileges, including the right to intervene to preserve order. So what does that mean? That means if anything goes wrong in Cuba, America has the right to go to Cuba and straighten Cuba out. Like the same way if I hear my kid fighting or yelling in their bedroom, I can bust in their bedroom and order them to stop. That's the way the United States can bust into Cuba and just start making changes in Cuba if they don't like what's going on in Cuba. If they think something in Cuba is happening, that the United States has the right to enter Cuba, to intervene and preserve order, to keep the government running the way the U.S. wants. That's one thing that was added in that Platt Amendment. Another thing in the Platt Amendment is that the United States gets to limit Cuba's right to deal with other countries. So again, in keeping with that Monroe Doctrine, we now have the right to tell Cuba that it can't deal with Europeans, that it doesn't get to make its own choice about who it wants to trade with or have military alliances with. Again, this is not treating Cuba as if it is an independent sovereign nation. This is treating Cuba like it's your child, like you have the right to order it around. This is not how an independent country should be treated. But that's what's happening with the Platt Amendment, that the United States has a right to decide or to help to control who Cuba deals with. All right. We also make Cuba adopt a sugar quota. So what does that mean? Again, if you remember from the beginning of this PowerPoint, I was talking about the fact that the U.S. had a very strong trading relationship with Cuba because Cuba grew a lot of sugar, and we had a big business relationship with them, and we're really dependent on that crop. What the U.S. does is it institutes a quota on Cuba, forcing Cuba to provide the United States with sugar. We force Cuba to provide us with sugar. Cuba does not have the right to make independent choices about its economy. Cuba does not have the right to build an economy based on multiple products. What happens is because they're forced to supply the U.S. with sugar, and of course supply it at a very good, cheap price. And if you remember from one of the lessons, the earlier lessons, what are the reasons, what are the drivers for imperialism? And we said some of the economic reasons were because they supply you with raw materials and markets. Well, this is an example. Cuba is forced to provide the United States with this raw material, with sugar, and they have to provide it for us really cheap. One of the problems with this is when a country's economy is based on only one crop. If sugar is selling at a good price and the weather works well and you're able to produce lots of sugar and the sugar is being sold at a good price, your country's going to do fine. The problem is when you have all your eggs in one basket. I think I've talked about this before. When your entire economy is based on one product, if something goes wrong, what if something goes wrong? What happens if the price of sugar suddenly drops? What if there happens to be a storm or a disease that affects the sugar crop? You're in trouble. You're done. You have nothing to back you up. You get what I'm saying? If your economy is based on 5 different products and something goes wrong with one, well, at least you got 4 others, right? But Cuba doesn't have that option because of the Platt Amendment. Because the United States could force Cuba to supply it with sugar, Cuba is dependent on the sugar crop. And if something goes wrong with the sugar crop, Cuba's entire economy is going to be messed up. So this has a really big negative effect on Cuba's economy. The last part of the Platt Amendment that you should be aware of is Guantanamo Bay. We're going to talk about Guantanamo Bay at the end of the year. It's kind of infamous for the fact that it has a prison camp located on it. But what happens is Guantanamo Bay is part of Cuba, and yet that piece of Cuba is basically controlled by the United States. That Cuba is forced to lease us this piece of land for $4,085 a year in perpetuity. That means forever. That Cuba is forced to make this land available to the United States forever. And I assure you, $4,000 a year, you can't rent a New York City apartment for $4,000 a year. That's ridiculous. So it's this amount of money is a joke. And yet this tiny bit of cash, we maintain control of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And that still exists today. That's why we have a prison camp located there where we house prisoners that are suspected of terrorist activities. We put them in Guantanamo Bay because since they are outside of the continent, since they're outside of the United States and they're not within a U.S. territory, we don't have to extend to them any habeas corpus. So they can be locked up with no rights. Anyway, we'll get into that more in the end of the year. But all you need to know is that we have this piece of land in Cuba for very little money, and Cuba is forced to provide it to the United States because of this Platt Amendment. All right, so as you can see, even though we fought this Spanish-American War, we were supposed to fight the Spanish-American War to help the Cubans and help the Philippines gain independence from Spain. And you can see with Cuba, technically they're independent, but really, thanks to the Platt Amendment, it's a very dependent independent. Instead of now kind of being part of the Spanish Empire, Cuba becomes a protectorate of the United States. Similar issue in the Philippines. Again, the Philippines had wanted independence from the Spanish Empire, and the U.S. had promised them independence, but instead we betray them and we do not give it to them. So the Philippines, after fighting with Spain, the Philippines then begin to fight with the United States. And there is a 4-year war. The Philippine-American War lasts 4 years at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, where now the Philippines stop fighting Spain and they start fighting the U.S. again for independence. Spoiler alert, the U.S. wins, so the Philippines are going to lose. And it's a very, very bloody, horrible war. And it's very rarely covered on the Regents. They really don't get into details. And very few people probably even know about it, or at least people who aren't Filipino. But it was a very brutal war, as you can see. About 100,000 to 200,000 people die in this war. Most of them are Philippine civilians because it's fought on their land. Only 4,000, little over 4,000 Americans killed. It supposedly was incredibly brutal, that there are reports of war atrocities about concentration camps and rape and torture of prisoners and civilians executed and just real brutal conditions. You can see the picture in the bottom right where there's kind of bodies in a ditch. Supposedly the U.S. was really just brutal to the Philippine people. I mean, real terrible. And stories about the Philippine-American War start to change public opinion. Again, yellow journalism, the explosion of the Maine, was all driving people to say, oh, look at those cruel Spanish people. We have to protect these people from Spain. Meanwhile, we're as brutal, if not more brutal, than the Spanish, basically. So this is going to start changing people's opinions, all right? And again, similar to Cuba, the Philippines are not given independence, and instead they become a U.S. protectorate. When the United States wins the Philippine-American War, the Philippines become a U.S. protectorate. All right, with that, you are done. And please check out the quiz in Google Classroom.